My dad treated my scars like a flaw in his legacy. You repulsed me, he sneered, hiding me from 50 VIP guests. That was how my father, a narcissistic real estate mogul, humiliated me on my own wedding day. The crystal-lit banquet hall instantly turned into a ruthless courtroom. The microphone shrieked with a piercing screech. Standing on the podium with a champagne glass in hand, his eyes swept over his wealthy partners before locking dead onto my heavily burned face. "Maybe you should wear a veil," he announced into the mic, his twisted smirk sinking straight into my chest. "It ruins the appetite of our esteemed guests." A cold blade plunged directly into my dignity. I, a Navy officer who survived 1,000-degree flames, was being stripped of my humanity by my own blood. Beside me, my husband's fists clenched, his jaw popping with lethal intent. I placed a firm hand on his arm, issuing a silent tactical command: "Hold position." Under pressure, a soldier does not scream. I clamped my jaw shut. I said nothing. Until a Navy vet in dress blues stood up, tears welling in his eyes. He choked out, "That's the woman from the fire. If you know exactly what it feels like to be treated like an outcast by the very people who share your blood, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and do not look away." Because the ruthless lesson my father learned that night about true honor is a moment you will never forget. I came home on emergency leave after a training exercise left second-degree burns across my forearm. The skin was still raw and weeping under the gauze. The front door was unlocked. The house smelled like imported lilies and furniture polish, the scent of wealth that existed solely to impress people who didn't live there. I dropped my duffel bag in the hallway, the heavy canvas thudding against the polished hardwood, and walked into the living room. The silver 5x7 frame that had held the Martin family portrait for 11 years sat in its usual place on the shelf above the fireplace. Same frame, same shelf, same angle catching the afternoon light. But the image inside it had been swapped. My father stood in the center of the new photo, one arm draped possessively over my mother's shoulder, the other resting on my sister Lena's back. They were posed in front of his newest commercial property, a glittering glass-fronted office complex, with his name etched into the cornerstone. All smiles, all teeth, all polish. I was not in the picture. I had been surgically removed from the family record, cut out like a defective component on an assembly line. I picked up the frame. My thumb left a smudge on the glass right over the spot where my face used to be. I turned it over. The backing clip was still warm. The replacement print was a rush job from the same day. He hadn't even waited a full week. I set the frame back down, aligning it exactly where it had been, matching the faint dust outline on the shelf with precision. I did not confront him. I filed it. A soldier catalogs intelligence before acting on it. My father built his entire empire on flawless facades. Buildings, brochures, business dinners, every element of his life was a curated advertisement for a man who did not actually exist. A human being only held value in his universe if they enhanced the perfect family portrait he sold to his investors and country club associates. When I returned from my first real combat deployment with a face heavily scarred by 1,000-degree flames, I immediately became a defective product in his legacy assembly line. The rejection was not loud. There was no confrontation, no tearful argument, no dramatic disowning. It was a silent, calculated campaign of erasure. First, the photos disappeared. Then the holiday invitations stopped arriving at my base housing. Then my chair at the dining table was replaced with a decorative plant. During his lavish networking dinners, he would intercept me at the bottom of the stairs before I could reach the dining room. His timing was always surgical. He'd appear the moment my boot hit the first-floor landing, blocking the hallway with his body like a bouncer at a velvet rope. He shoved a porcelain plate of food into my chest, the rim pressing against my sternum. "You should stay in the room to avoid startling the guests." He ordered, his eyes darting nervously toward the driveway, where a black Escalade was pulling in. His voice never rose above a whisper. Cruelty didn't need volume in his house. I took the plate. I retreated to the upstairs hallway. I sat on the carpet outside my old bedroom with my back against the wall. A habit from combat: always keep a solid surface behind you, eating roasted duck off fine china while the laughter of strangers and the clink of crystal floated up through the floorboards beneath me. He had convinced himself I was just a lowly desk clerk, shuffling cheap paperwork in some forgotten administrative corner of the military, because no civilian company would ever hire someone who looked like me. He never asked about my rank. He never asked about my deployments. He never asked about the metals accumulating in a velvet-lined box in my base housing closet. I never corrected him. An officer has no obligation to report her achievements to cowards. My sister Lena thrived as the golden child. She lived off meaningless internet likes, curated selfies, and sponsored partnerships with teeth-whitening brands. Her entire existence was a performance optimized for the algorithm. On the day she hit 1 million followers, my father organized a surprise in the driveway. I watched through the upstairs window as he pulled a silk blindfold off her eyes and dangled the keys to a brand new luxury sports car, a sleek candy apple red convertible that cost more than my annual salary. Lena squealed, jumping up and down on the asphalt in her designer heels while her ring light crew captured every angle. My father beamed. He wrapped his arm around her shoulders for the photo. He looked like a man who had finally produced something worth displaying. That same afternoon, I pulled into the driveway in the beat-up, reliable pickup truck I had just bought with my military hazard pay. The paint was faded. The passenger side mirror was held on with electrical tape, but the engine was bulletproof. The tires were rated for mud and gravel, and it was mine paid for with money I earned by volunteering to handle explosives that other soldiers refused to touch. My father walked a slow circle around the truck, his lip curled in theatrical disgust. He tapped his expensive watch against the dusty fender, leaving a small scratch in the clear coat. "You buy trash because you think of yourself as trash," he scoffed, not even looking at me. He turned toward the house. "You skip the holidays because you have a crippling inferiority complex." He had no idea that during those specific holidays, the Thanksgiving, he accused me of boycotting the Christmas. He told his partners I was too antisocial to attend. I was waist-deep in mud on a forward operating base, diffusing live ordnance that had been buried in a road scheduled for a convoy of 18-year-old Marines the next morning. While Lena was filming a sponsored holiday unboxing video in a temperature-controlled studio, I was lying on my stomach in 30-degree rain using a pair of needle-nose pliers to disarm a pressure plate that would have turned a Humvee into a coffin. I became accustomed to being a ghost in my own house. I treated my visits home like covert observation missions behind enemy lines. I noted exit routes. I mapped behavioral patterns. I cataloged trigger phrases. I locked my emotions in a steel vault, observing their pathetic vanity with the cold eyes of an intelligence operative documenting a hostile network. My father's networking dinners. Lena's photo shoots. My mother's practiced silence, the way she looked at the wall. Whenever my father spoke about me, her fingers tightening around her wine glass, but her mouth never opening. I logged every insult, every dismissal, every locked door, every porcelain plate shoved into my chest at the bottom of the stairs. They thought their silence broke me. They did not realize they were just building my tolerance for the impending war. The scars my father called a hideous deformity were actually the most expensive medals of my military career. 6 years before that wedding, an explosion in the shipyard turned the USS Concord into a massive floating cauldron of fire. I was the commanding officer of a Navy Explosive Ordnance Disposal Unit holding the rank of Lieutenant 03, a commissioned officer responsible for every soul in her detachment. The alarm ripped through the dock at 3:47 a.m. I was in the operations trailer reviewing disposal manifests when the first blast punched through the hull like a fist through drywall. The trailer windows cracked. Coffee mugs slid off desks. I was already sprinting toward the pier before the second explosion sent a column of black smoke 300 feet into the night sky. The air at the dock was thick and unbreathable. The suffocating smell of ozone, sulfur, and burning flesh choked the entire pier. Black smoke poured from the ship's midsection like blood from a severed artery, rolling across the concrete in heavy, low-hanging waves that burned the eyes and coated the tongue with the taste of charred metal. Intelligence confirmed a squad of 5 sailors was trapped in the engine room, pinned right next to an ammunition depot that was heating to critical mass. The hull groaned a deep metallic scream of a vessel tearing itself apart from the inside. Support beams buckled. Rivets popped like gunshots. My executive officer grabbed my arm at the base of the gangway. His face was slick with sweat, reflecting the orange glow of the fire. "Lieutenant, the blast radius covers the entire dock," he shouted over the roar. "If that depot goes, we lose the whole pier, the adjacent dry dock, and every soul within 400 meters. I pulled my arm free. I looked at the ship. I looked at the fire climbing the superstructure like a living creature devouring its prey. I ran the numbers. 5 sailors. Estimated 12 minutes before the ammunition cooked off. One viable entry point through the portside maintenance hatch, 2 decks below the fire line. The math was simple. The math was always simple. The execution was where you paid. Safety protocols demanded we pull back and let the fire burn out. Going in was a guaranteed suicide mission according to every risk assessment model the Navy had ever written. My mind turned into a block of solid ice amidst the flames. I ordered my executive officer to hold the perimeter, get the medical team staged at the extraction point with burn kits and stretchers, and radio the base hospital to prep the trauma bay. I grabbed the heavy hydraulic cutters from the equipment rack, slung them across my back 42 pounds of hardened steel, and plunged straight into the pitch-black smoke. The corridors inside the Concorde were a labyrinth of twisted steel, ruptured steam pipes, and electrical fires spitting blue sparks from exposed cable runs. I navigated by touch, running my gloved hand along the starboard bulkhead, counting door frames. 1, 2, 3, turn left at the 4th. The heat pressed against my suit like a living thing, squeezing the oxygen from my lungs in slow, crushing increments. Emergency lighting had failed completely. The only illumination came from the fires burning through the overhead cable trays, casting everything in a hellish, pulsing orange that turned the passageway into something out of a furnace. Water from the fire suppression system that hadn't yet failed dripped from the ceiling in scalding rivulets hissing against my helmet and shoulders. I found them in the engine room. 4 sailors were down. 2 unconscious, their faces blackened with soot, their breathing shallow and ragged. A 3rd was propped against the bulkhead, cradling a broken forearm. The 4th, a young petty officer, barely 20, was screaming, pinned under a section of collapsed steel beam that had buckled from the heat and dropped across his legs. And standing over all of them, trying to pry the beam off his men with his bare hands, was a seasoned Master Chief rank E9. His palms were blistered raw, the skin peeling back in white strips. His name tape was melted. The ammunition depot was 12 feet behind them, and the steel casing of the nearest munitions rack was glowing a dull, sickening red. The ambient temperature inside that compartment was so extreme that it began melting the plastic visor of my helmet right onto my face. I felt the material soften, then adhere, then fuse with my skin along the left cheekbone. The pain was immediate and absolute, a white-hot drill boring straight through the nerve endings and into the bone. I ignored it. Pain is information. Information is manageable. I engaged the hydraulic cutters, positioned the jaws around the base of the collapsed beam, and squeezed the trigger. The machine shrieked against the steel, a high-pitched grinding that added another layer to the cacophony of alarms and groaning metal. The beam shifted. I repositioned. Squeezed again. The jaws bit through. The beam section fell away. I dragged the first 2 unconscious sailors by their collar grips, hauling them down the corridor toward the maintenance hatch. I went back. I pulled the 3rd sailor to his feet, bracing his broken arm against his chest, and guided him to the corridor. I went back again. I freed the petty officer's legs from the wreckage, hoisted him into a fireman's carry, and moved him out. As I reached for the last man, the Master Chief, the overhead structure gave way. I heard the groan before I saw it. I threw myself over his body, using my back as a human shield. A blazing steel beam collapsed directly onto my protective gear. The suit didn't hold. The material fused directly into my flesh, a sensation I can only describe as being branded by God. The agony drilled straight into my bone marrow, radiating outward in waves that turned my vision white. But I refused to scream. I locked my jaw so hard I cracked a molar. I channeled every volt of pain into my arms, my legs, my core, and I dragged him. I hauled him through the corridor, over the debris, through the maintenance hatch, and onto the dock. My legs gave out 3 steps past the gangway. I dropped to my knees on the concrete. The medical team swarmed. Hands grabbed me. Someone was cutting my suit off with trauma shears. My executive officer's voice cut through the chaos from somewhere above me. Athena is down. Athena is down. Get the trauma bird in the air. In my world, the price of a teammate's life is paid in blood, and it is a transaction I will gladly make every single time. The medics airlifted me to the Naval Medical Center on a stretcher. I spent the next 8 months in a sterile burn unit, fighting through 17 skin grafts, 3 systemic infections, and the slow, excruciating process of relearning how to breathe without a tube. I traded my flawless skin for 5 breathing sailors. That was the reality of my existence, a reality my father could never comprehend, because he had never traded anything of value for anyone other than himself. Civilians often assume I stayed in contact with my toxic family out of weakness. They are incorrect. I sat at the metal desk in my base housing apartment 3 months before the wedding, holding a cream-colored envelope addressed to Mr. Richard Martin. The paper stock was heavy, expensive, paid for entirely from my officer's salary and Liam's intelligence analyst pay. The embossed lettering caught the light from the bare overhead bulb. I pressed my thumb against the sealed flap. I did not move for 6 minutes. I counted. Tactical breathing, 4 seconds in, 4 seconds hold, 4 seconds out. I was not hesitating. I was performing a final threat assessment on a decision I'd already made. The core conditioning of a Navy soldier demands we never abandon a mission, even when the mission is a losing one. Even when every intelligence report screams that the objective is compromised, that the asset is hostile, that the probability of a positive outcome rounds to zero. To me, this family was a prolonged, exhausting operation. I operated with the mindset of a diplomat walking into a war zone, armed, alert, body armor under the suit, but extending an olive branch because the mission parameters required it. I had tried every approach in the diplomatic playbook: silence, compliance, achievement, distance, proximity. None of it penetrated. But I invited my father to my wedding, aiming for a final truce, calculating that on my most important day, the one day that was supposed to be about me, he would finally view me as a human being rather than a PR liability. I placed the envelope in the outgoing mail slot. The metal lid clanged shut. I chose to stand tall in the crossfire of their disdain, because my true armor was forged by a man who never once treated me like damaged equipment. Liam was a Navy intelligence analyst stationed at Norfolk. He was methodical, intensely observant, and possessed a lethal, quiet loyalty that operated on a frequency most people couldn't detect. Our bond was never a sappy romance pulled from a greeting card. It was a solid, impenetrable trench, the kind you dig shoulder to shoulder under fire, where trust isn't declared but demonstrated under pressure. We met during a joint threat assessment briefing. He was seated 3 chairs to my left, taking notes with a mechanical pencil, and I caught him watching me during my analysis of a pattern in the threat data that none of the senior officers had identified. He didn't look impressed. He looked confirmed, like a hypothesis he'd been building had just been validated. He sought me out in the corridor afterward, extending his hand. He looked directly at my scarred face without flinching, without the micro-grimace I had spent years learning to detect in civilians, without the performative sympathy that was somehow worse than the disgust. 2 months before the wedding, I stood in the bathroom of our shared apartment, tracing the raised, jagged skin along my jawline in the mirror. The fluorescent light was merciless. Every ridge, every discolored patch, every place where the skin graft didn't quite match the surrounding tissue, all of it exposed under the cold white glare. I traced the topography with my index finger. The scar tissue had no nerve endings in some places. Dead zones. Numb geography on a face that used to be symmetrical. Liam stepped up behind me. I saw his reflection appear over my right shoulder. He did not look away. He did not offer empty words about inner beauty or tell me it didn't matter. He looked at my scars the way a geographer looks at the lines of a majestic mountain range, with reverence, with the deep understanding that the landscape had been shaped by forces most people would never survive, and that the result was not damage, but evidence of magnitude. He leaned forward. He kissed the side of my burned cheek, his lips pressing directly against the uneven ridge of scar tissue that ran from my ear to the corner of my mouth. He locked eyes with me in the mirror. "You are the most beautiful warrior I have ever known," he stated, delivering the words like an irrefutable intelligence report. Factual, classified, final. That unconditional validation became my shield. This wedding was supposed to be Liam's and my vow to the world, a declaration that 2 soldiers could build something permanent and sacred outside the chaos of deployment cycles and burn wards. We funded the entire event ourselves. Every centerpiece, every chair rental, every catering invoice, every yard of white linen paid from our combined military salaries. No trust fund, no family contribution, no strings attached to a narcissist's checkbook. I allowed my father to attend out of a final, calculated act of diplomacy, severely underestimating the sheer cruelty of a narcissist who was about to lose the one thing he could not survive: losing the spotlight. I stepped into my bridal suite, adjusting the crisp lines of my dress, preparing for the ceremony, entirely unaware that a hostile ambush had already been set. The operation to humiliate me was orchestrated by my father like a miniature military campaign, complete with objectives, timing, and a total disregard for collateral damage. 30 minutes before the ceremony, while I sat quietly in the bridal suite reviewing the seating chart one final time, the heavy oak door swung open. No knock, no congratulations, no bouquet of flowers, no fatherly tear in the eye. My father stepped in, filling the doorframe with his 6'2" frame, a tailored charcoal suit, and a suffocating cloud of cologne so thick it coated the back of my throat. His eyes immediately scanned my dress, a fitted, elegant gown with a high neckline I had specifically chosen to cover the worst of the scarring along my collarbone and upper chest. His gaze climbed from the hem to my waist, up to the neckline, then locked onto the severe burns, trailing up my throat and across the left side of my jaw. His nostrils flared. He adjusted his silk tie with the calculated indifference of a man rearranging deck chairs at a corporate retreat, treating my dressing room like his personal boardroom. He did not waste breath on pleasantries. I moved the Henderson Group partners away from the center. He stated in a flat transactional tone, as if he were restructuring a quarterly earnings report instead of addressing his daughter 30 minutes before she walked down the aisle. I froze. My hand was still holding a pearl earring half raised to my lobe. I stared at him through the vanity mirror. He met my gaze in the reflection without a flinch. To preserve the family image, he continued straightening his French cuffs. He paused for effect, a boardroom tactic designed to make the other party fill the silence with compliance. They are people who appreciate beauty. You understand, Kathy. It was a surgical strike. A cold, precise dagger straight into my emotional jugular slipped between the ribs of my armor at the one seam I had left unguarded, the hope that today would be different. He was weaponizing my wedding. The event I paid for, the event I planned, the day I'd earned with blood and fire, into a PR stage for his real estate empire. And I was the stain he needed to bleach out before the investors arrived. My chest tightened. The pearl earring pressed into my palm, the small sphere digging a circular indentation into my skin. But my military conditioning quarantined the pain before it could reach my face. I did not throw the makeup brush at him. I did not cry. I did not give him the satisfaction of seeing a crack. I gave him a single curt nod. Understood. I replied coldly, my voice flat and stripped of all inflection, the same tone I used when acknowledging an order I intended to overrule the moment the superior officer left the room. My eyes tracked his reflection as he turned and walked out, leaving the door wide open, a final act of disrespect, as if my private space wasn't worth the basic courtesy of a closed door. The peace treaty was officially dead. I had entered this wedding hoping for a diplomatic resolution. I now accepted my position on the front line of a war that my father had been waging since the day I came home with scars instead of a modeling portfolio. Liam found me 3 minutes later. He stepped into the suite, and the open door told him everything his training needed to know. He read the scene the way he read an intelligence brief. The door left open like a territorial mark, the tension radiating off my posture, the pearl earring still pressed into my palm instead of clipped to my ear. He closed the door behind him, quietly, deliberately. The soft click of the latch was louder than any word he could have spoken. He did not ask what happened. He had been an intelligence analyst long enough to recognize that my jaw only locked at that specific angle, molars grinding, masseter muscle visibly flexing when someone had breached a critical boundary. I kept my voice low, my words stripped to tactical shorthand. He moved the Henderson Group away from center stage, I said, not turning from the mirror, to hide my face from his investors. Liam's left hand curled into a controlled fist at his side. His knuckles whitened, but his face remained a mask of operational composure, the face of a man trained to process rage as data rather than emotion. He stepped forward and kissed my forehead. His lips were dry and warm against the one patch of unscarred skin above my brow. Stay on mission, he said quietly. We handle this on our terms. There was a massive tactical error in my father's arrogant calculus, a variable he had not accounted for because his intelligence was fatally limited by his own ego. When finalizing the guest list weeks earlier, Liam had quietly submitted a name for the groom's side. No fanfare, no explanation. Just a name typed into the RSVP spreadsheet, Master Chief Petty Officer Thorne. Thorne was Liam's biological uncle, a reclusive Navy veteran who had retired from active service after a severe occupational injury, left him with chronic nightmares. a permanent limp that flared in cold weather, and a chest full of medals he kept in a shoebox under his bed because looking at them made him weep. What my father did not know, what nobody in the Martin family could have possibly calculated, was that Thorn was the Master Chief I had pulled from the flaming engine room of the USS Concord 6 years ago. For 6 agonizing years, Thorn had been searching for the classified identity of the officer who dragged him through the fire. He carried that debt like a loaded weapon, chambered and ready to safety, worn smooth from years of restless thumbing. Fate had quietly slipped a live ticking time bomb right beneath the golden throne of my father's delusional empire, and nobody heard it counting down. Which brings us back to the exact moment my father insulted my face over the microphone and the old sailor stood up. The heavy scrape of a wooden chair violently pushing back against marble echoed through the dead, silent hall. The sound was brutal raw wood grinding against polished stone, and it cut through the stunned vacuum left by my father's insult like a bayonet through paper. Every head in the room turned toward the back table. Master Chief Thorn slowly drew himself up from his seat. His posture was as rigid and imposing as the mast of a battleship, his spine locked at full extension, his chin lifted to the exact angle drilled into him during 32 years of naval service. The heavy medals on the chest of his navy dress blues, 3 rows of ribbons and 2 bronze stars slammed together as he straightened, creating a sharp metallic clink that instantly overpowered the cheap vanity of the designer suits surrounding him. His calloused hands hung at his sides trembling. Not from weakness, not from age. From 6 years of compressed grief and survivor's guilt now detonating inside his ribcage like a depth charge finally reaching its target. Sir, Thorn's deep, gravelly voice boomed across the banquet hall. It carried the heavy weight of artillery fire, not loud but dense, a sound that hit your chest before it reached your ears. It struck directly at my father on the podium. My father's champagne glass froze halfway to his lips. The bubbles in the flute kept rising. Everything else stopped. I was trapped under a bulkhead in the engine room of the USS Concord 6 years ago. Thorn took a step forward. His polished dress shoes clicked against the marble floor, a measured, deliberate strike, the footfall of a man advancing on a target. The fire was cooking the ammo depot right next to us. Melting metal was dripping on our heads. He paused. His throat worked against the words, the tendons in his neck straining. We read our Bibles, waiting for death. The silence in the room was so complete I could hear the ice shifting in someone's water glass 3 tables away. Thorn turned his weathered face toward me. His eyes pale blue, rimmed with decades of sun damage, and sleepless nights shifted from shock to absolute reverence. It happened in a single blink. One moment, he was a man confronting a bully. The next, he was a soldier recognizing his commanding officer. Heavy tears cut through the deep wrinkles on his cheeks, carving wet trails through 30 years of salt spray and combat sun. His lower lip quivered. But his voice did not break. A Master Chief does not break. A Master Chief bends the world around him until it complies. And then a Navy EOD officer appeared. His voice dropped to a near whisper that somehow filled every corner of the 200-seat banquet hall, carried by the acoustic authority of a man who had spent 3 decades making himself heard over gunfire, diesel engines, and the screaming of wounded sailors. A tiny woman who used a cutter to tear open the steel hatch. She dragged us out using her own body as a shield when the wall behind us blew. He stopped. He swallowed a hard, agonizing breath that moved visibly through his entire body's shoulders, contracting chest-heaving fists clenching at his sides. The last thing I saw before I passed out was her helmet melting, her gear engulfed in flames. The room was a vacuum. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. A woman at the nearest table had her hand pressed flat against her chest, her fingers white. A waiter standing by the service door had set his tray down on the floor without realizing it. We never knew her name. The file was classified. Thorn's voice climbed, now gaining altitude and force building like a wave that had been gathering energy across 6,000 miles of open ocean. We only knew our savior by her call sign, Athena. The name Athena rang out razor-sharp, slicing through the hypocrisy in the room like a tracer round cutting through smoke. It hung in the air. It echoed off the crystal chandeliers. It embedded itself in the walls. Thorn pivoted on his heel with the precision of a parade ground maneuver, locking a blazing glare onto my father. The old sailor's body was shaking, his metals rattling softly against each other, but his voice was a cannon loaded and aimed. That female officer bearing those burn scars. He jabbed a thick, scarred finger directly at me, his arm extended like the barrel of a rifle. Your daughter is an EOD lieutenant, a hero wearing the silver star. She is not trash for you to hide, sir. I sat perfectly still. The breath left my lungs in a single silent rush. The phantom weight of the fire on my back, the ghost of that steel beam, the memory of melting gear and scorching flesh was suddenly replaced by the overwhelming, crushing weight of absolute justice. I gripped the edge of the table with both hands, not for support, for containment, because the emotion flooding my chest was so massive, so ancient, so raw. Years of locked doors, porcelain plates, erased photos, and whispered insults that it threatened to crack the armor I had spent a decade welding shut. I held the table. I held the line. I know how exhausting it is to constantly prove your worth to people who refuse to see you. If Thorne's defense made you feel a spark of vindication, hit the like button and tell me in the comments if you've ever had to cut a toxic family member out of your life to protect your peace. A massive wave of gasps and frantic, shocked whispers swept through the banquet hall. The sound was a living thing. It rippled outward from the back table, where Thorne stood crashing against the walls in concentric waves, flooding the VIP section, where the Henderson Group partners were sitting with their mouths open and their napkins frozen halfway to their faces. A woman in a designer gown covered her mouth with both hands. An older man with a military pin on his lapel slowly removed his glasses and cleaned them, a stalling gesture. I recognized he was buying time to process what he had just witnessed. But instead of immediate remorse, my father's deranged narcissistic survival instinct kicked in. A narcissist never accepts defeat. They don't possess the neural pathways for surrender. When the mask is ripped off, they reach for another mask. My father gripped the microphone so hard his knuckles turned white, the tendons in his wrist straining against the skin, like cables on a bridge under excessive load. A pathetic, forced chuckle escaped his lips, the sound a con man makes when the mark suddenly produces a badge. Sweat beaded on his forehead in fat, glistening drops that caught the chandelier light. His eyes darted frantically toward the VIP tables, scanning for allies, searching for a single face that still believed in his curated reality. He licked his lips. He adjusted his tie with his free hand, the same compulsive gesture he performed in every boardroom when a deal was hemorrhaging and the investors were heading for the exits. Everyone, I apologize for this disruption. My father stammered into the mic, his voice dripping with slimy desperation. The polished CEO baritone he had spent decades cultivating was cracking, revealing the thin, reedy voice of a man who had never had to defend a position he hadn't purchased. He held up his palm toward Thorne, a dismissive, condescending gesture he had perfected on subordinate employees, the kind of wave that says, "Sit down, you are beneath me." Perhaps the veteran here has had too much to drink. He let out another manufactured chuckle, glancing at the Henderson Group table for validation. The Henderson Group CEO stared back without blinking. No validation came. My father plowed forward anyway, his mouth running on pure survival instinct, now disconnected from the rational brain that should have been screaming at him to stop talking. He must be drunk. Or confused from PTSD. My father continued, the words tumbling out faster, now sloppier, a man throwing sandbags at a river that had already breached the levee. My daughter is just an eccentric desk clerk in the rear echelon. She couldn't possibly. He was actively trying to rewrite reality in front of 200 witnesses. Gaslighting an entire room. Banking on the crowd believing a wealthy CEO in a custom suit over a traumatized veteran in dress blues. He was reaching into his oldest, most reliable playbook, the same playbook he had used on me at the bottom of the stairs for years. The same mechanism that had convinced him I was invisible, worthless, a blemish on his legacy. I did not flinch. I did not stand. I sat with my hands folded on the table, my spine straight, my breathing controlled at a steady 4-count rhythm, and I watched him dig his own grave one shovelful at a time. A soldier knows when to hold fire. Some targets destroy themselves. I am not mistaken, Thorne roared. He didn't need a microphone. His voice carried the raw, terrifying authority of a battlefield commander who had spent 3 decades making himself heard over the deafening chaos of combat operations, over helicopter rotors, over artillery, over the screaming of the wounded. It crashed through my father's feeble lies like a tank rolling over a paper wall, flattening every syllable of his desperate defense into silence. The chandelier crystals vibrated. A wine glass near the podium hummed. A woman at the nearest table flinched and grabbed her husband's arm, her fingernails digging into his jacket. Thorne took 3 deliberate steps toward the podium, closing the distance between himself and my father. Each footfall was a controlled detonation, heel-toe, heel-toe. The measured advance of a man who had stormed positions defended by machine guns and wasn't about to be stopped by a real estate developer with a sweaty microphone. A soldier never forgets the eyes of the one who snatched him from death. Thorne's finger was still locked on my father, unwavering, a targeting laser that would not release. His metals caught the light with every heave of his chest, flashing gold and bronze. And you, Mr. Martin, are a supreme coward for feeling ashamed of a living legend of the United States Navy. That was the kill shot. The final counterattack of my abuser was entirely shattered by the brutal weight of reality. My father's face drained of all blood, the carefully maintained country club tan evaporating in real time, turning a sickly, ghostly white that made him look like a man who had just been told he had 24 hours to live. His shoulders caved inward, a physical collapse of the internal scaffolding that had held up his fake persona for decades. The microphone trembled in his grip. He looked toward the Henderson Group table for the last time. The CEO of Henderson Group, a silver-haired man named Walter Henderson, who had done 3 tours in Vietnam before building his construction empire. A man who had buried Marines and poured concrete with the same hands, was staring at my father with a look of such pure, concentrated disgust that it could have corroded steel plate. Walter slowly pushed his chair back from the table, a deliberate, unmistakable disengagement. Several other business partners followed suit. They deliberately set their wine glasses down on the table with a hard clack, a synchronized civilian version of a vote of no confidence. Arms crossed. Chairs turned physically away from the podium. One woman in a pearl necklace pulled out her phone, shook her head with a look of utter contempt, and began typing what I could only assume was either a social media post or a text to her attorney. A man in a pinstripe suit stood up, dropped his napkin on his plate, and walked toward the exit without looking back. My father's phone would be ringing off the hook by morning, with canceled contracts and withdrawn partnerships. In exactly 2 minutes, the empire he had spent 30 years constructing, every handshake, every networking dinner, every daughter hidden in an upstairs room, was detonated by a single truth-telling old sailor in dress blues. My father did not apologize. Narcissists do not possess the software for genuine remorse. When their mask is violently ripped off in public, they only have one programmed response: retreat, regroup, deny. He let the microphone slip from his sweaty fingers. It hit the wooden stage with a loud, piercing thud, a heavy, resonant crack that echoed through the hall like a judge's gavel delivering a final verdict. He and my mother ducked their heads simultaneously, refusing to make eye contact with a single person in the room. My mother's hand was clamped over her mouth, mascara running in 2 dark rivulets down her cheeks. Her eyes were wide, not with shame, but with the animal panic of a woman who had spent 30 years enabling a monster and had just realized the cage was open. They power-walked toward the side exit, slinking out the side door like cowards abandoning a lost trench. My father's shoulder clipped the doorframe on the way out. He didn't stop. He didn't adjust. He just kept moving his Italian leather shoes, squeaking against the marble with each hurried, humiliating step. Their departure did not ruin the reception. It felt like a massive exorcism. The suffocating toxic air that had choked the room since my father first grabbed the microphone instantly evaporated, leaving behind a clean, breathable vacuum. The tension dissolved like smoke sucked out through a ventilation shaft. Conversations resumed in low, awed murmurs. I remained seated, my breathing slow and tactical, my hands still flat on the table. I watched the heavy wooden door swing shut behind them. It closed with a solid, definitive click, the sound of a blast door sealing a contaminated compartment. That click severed the last invisible chain holding me to my childhood trauma. Liam reached over, lacing his fingers tightly through mine. His hand was steady, warm, an anchor dropped in still water. The moment the door clicked shut, a man in a tailored navy suit sitting at the back table slowly stood up. He set down his napkin with deliberate precision, smoothing the linen flat on the table before rising to his full height. It was Vice Admiral Peterson, my direct 3-star commander, attending in civilian clothes out of respect for the personal nature of the event. He had been sitting quietly through the entire confrontation, his face unreadable, his hands folded on the table. Now he buttoned his jacket with one hand, his spine straightening into the rigid posture of a man who had commanded carrier strike groups and nuclear submarines. Immediately following his lead, Liam's intelligence captain stood up from 2 tables over. Then a warrant officer near the bar set down his bourbon and rose. Then a retired gunnery sergeant who had flown in from California for the wedding. Then a Navy nurse. Then a young ensign who had served under me at Norfolk. One by one, a dozen military guests rose from their seats, some in dress uniforms, some in civilian suits, all of them moving with the same trained, synchronized precision. In perfect silent unison, they snapped their bodies to attention and threw up a razor-sharp salute directed entirely at me. The rest of the civilian crowd erupted into deafening applause. A woman I had never met, one of Liam's distant cousins, stood up from a side table, tears streaming down her face, and began clapping so hard her palms turned red. The Henderson Group's CEO rose to his feet and joined the ovation, his Vietnam era bearing, making every other standing civilian look like they were slouching. The sound crashed over me like a tidal wave. It was not polite society function clapping. It was the raw, unfiltered roar of 200 people who had just witnessed an act of cosmic justice delivered by a trembling old sailor with a chest full of medals and a debt he had carried for 6 years. Amidst the roaring applause, I shifted my gaze to my sister Lena. She was standing frozen at her table, separated from the celebration by a wall of her own irrelevance. Her jaw was slack. The phone she had been using to live stream the entire reception, capturing what she had assumed would be content for her followers. A glamorous wedding at Daddy's country club slipped from her manicured fingers, dropping onto the carpet with a soft, muffled thud. She did not pick it up. The eyes that had always looked at me with smug pity, those perfectly contoured, influencer-polished eyes, framed by false lashes and highlight powder, were now blown wide with terror, awe, and a crushing, irreversible sense of shame. The ring light that usually illuminated her curated world had been replaced by something she could not filter, could not edit, could not swipe away. She finally realized in a single devastating flash of clarity that her designer dresses and her million fake internet followers would never carry a fraction of the weight of the scars on my face. For the first time in 25 years, Lena Martin had nothing to post. The wedding reception instantly transformed from my father's transactional networking event into something that no amount of money could have purchased. Master Chief Thorne bypassed the abandoned VIP tables, the spilled champagne, the empty chairs where my parents had been sitting minutes earlier. He marched directly toward the head table with the focused, deliberate stride of a man completing the most important mission of his remaining years on this earth. The hardened, weathered veteran, a man who had stared down machine gun fire in 3 combat theaters, who had carried coffins at Arlington, who had woken up screaming every night for 6 years because he survived and believed he shouldn't have stood before me with trembling shoulders and wet cheeks. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He didn't tell me everything would be okay. He squared up, locked eyes with me, and snapped a flawless salute. His hand was shaking, the fingers vibrating with emotion, but the angle was perfect. Textbook. The kind of salute that is only rendered to someone who has earned it with their own blood. I have waited 6 years to report to my commander that my squad made it home safe, Thorne said. His voice cracked under the immense weight of survivor's guilt, each word torn from somewhere deep inside his chest, like shrapnel being extracted without anesthesia. Thank you, Lieutenant. A hard lump formed in my throat. For the first time in over a decade, I felt the steel vault inside me begin to unlock the massive industrial door that I had welded shut the day my father replaced my photo on the mantle. The vault where I had stored every locked door, every porcelain plate, every whispered insult, every holiday spent alone in the mud. It was not cracking from weakness. It was opening from permission. I dropped the rigid, emotionless protocol that had been my operating system since childhood. I stood up. I stepped around the head table, and I wrapped my arms around the old sailor. He wept openly. His calloused, scarred fingers gripped my shoulders like a lifeline, like a drowning man who had finally touched the bottom and found something solid to push off from. His tears soaked through the silk of my gown at the shoulder, a warm, spreading dampness that I felt against my skin. His body shook against mine with 6 years of compressed guilt, 6 years of searching through classified files and dead-end FOIA requests, 6 years of waking up at 3 a.m. in a cold sweat reaching for a woman whose name he never knew. I held him. I held him the way I should have been held by my own father, and never was. As I pulled back, wiping the dampness from my cheek with the back of my hand, Liam's mother stepped out from the crowd. She was a small woman, 5'3", silver-streaked hair pulled back in a simple twist hands that had spent 40 years working in a school cafeteria and raising 3 boys on a postal worker's salary. She didn't hesitate. She didn't calculate the optics. She didn't scan the room for cameras. She walked right up to me and threw her arms around my neck. Her hands rested directly on the severely burned, uneven skin of my shoulder. The exact skin my father found so repulsive he couldn't look at it without wincing. The skin he rearranged entire seating charts to hide. She pressed her palms flat against the ridges and valleys of scar tissue, her fingers gentle but firm, completely unfazed by the texture. She held me tight. Her breath was warm against my ear. "Thank you for coming home alive, Kathy," she whispered. "This family is honored to have you." I closed my eyes. I let her warmth sink into my bones, past the armor, past the discipline, past the scar tissue, past the decade of locked doors and cold plates. That was the exact moment the final lock in my mind clicked open. The one I didn't even know existed. The one buried so deep beneath the military conditioning and the emotional fortifications that I thought it was load-bearing structure, not a barrier. I realized a brutal, liberating truth that settled into my chest like a round finding its target. Blood can manufacture relatives. It can assign last names, fill out birth certificates, hang portraits above fireplaces, and seat daughters at the back of the hall. But it cannot forge a family. True family is built purely in the trenches of loyalty, courage and unconditional respect, in burning engine rooms, in fluorescent-lit bathrooms, in school cafeterias, in the calloused grip of an old sailor who wept because you survived. I had finally found my tribe. None of them shared my last name. All of them would take a bullet for me. 6 months later, I stood on the elevated instructor's podium at the EOD training base in Florida, running the new class of officer candidates through advanced survival and disposal tactics. The candidates sat in bleacher rows, notebooks open, faces locked in the focused grimace of men and women who understood that the instructor standing in front of them had tested every theory in the manual with her own body. I paced the platform, pointing to the schematic of a pressure plate IED, calling out tactical scenarios, watching their responses. A candidate in the second row gave an incorrect answer about blast radius. I corrected him. He did not make the same mistake twice. A female candidate in the third row raised her hand. "Ma'am, how did you get the scars above your collar?" she asked, her chin up, her voice steady. I told her the truth. "Those are the tuition I paid for the lesson I'm teaching you right now," I said, tapping the schematic with my pointer. "Pay attention and you keep your skin. Hesitate and you pay the same tuition I did." She nodded. She never looked away from my scars again, but not out of revulsion, out of respect. Down in the front row of the bleachers, Liam and Master Chief Thorne sat side by side. Liam had a thermos of black coffee balanced on his knee, his analyst's eyes scanning the candidates the way he scanned intelligence reports, looking for patterns, weaknesses, potential. Thorne had his arms crossed, his dress shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows, revealing the burn scars on his forearms that matched mine. He nodded at the candidates who answered correctly. He shook his head slowly at the ones who hesitated. They were my rear guard, my impenetrable fortress. I dismissed the class. The candidates stood, gathered their materials, and filed toward the barracks. I walked back into the shade of the tactical command tent, pulling my phone from my tactical vest to check the time. A text message sat on the lock screen from an unsaved number. The area code was my father's. The arrogant syntax was unmistakable, the clipped imperative tone of a man who had never learned to ask for anything, because he had always been rich enough to demand it. It was my father. "Kathy, call me immediately." The message read, "Vice Admiral Peterson mentioned you operate under his command. I'm bidding on a naval port construction project on the East Coast. We, our family, put the past behind us and set up a meeting with him for me." I stared at the glowing pixels. I read the message twice, slowly. I waited for the familiar spike of adrenaline, the tightening in my chest, the metallic taste at the back of my tongue, the sting of betrayal that had been my constant companion for 15 years. I waited for the anger, the hurt, the desperate childlike hope that maybe this time he was reaching out because he missed me, Because he was sorry, because 6 months of living with the consequences of his actions had finally cracked through his pathological narcissism and reached something human underneath. But there was nothing. An absolute magnificent void of emotion. A clean, silent frequency. Static-free. No rage, no sorrow. No trace of the broken little girl who used to eat roasted duck on the hallway carpet hoping her father would come upstairs and sit with her. That girl was gone. She had been honorably discharged from my psyche the night a room full of strangers saluted her, and the man who made her wept into his champagne. He hadn't changed. He hadn't learned a single lesson from the night 200 people watched him flee his daughter's wedding through a side door. I later learned from Liam's contacts that 3 Henderson Group contracts had been terminated within a week of the reception. 2 of his commercial tenants had broken their leases, citing reputational concerns. His golden empire was hemorrhaging, and instead of examining why, he was already hunting for a new host to feed on. He saw my hard-earned military authority, the rank I purchased with 8 months in a burn unit, the connections I forged by saving 5 men from a burning ship, the respect I commanded by standing in front of explosive devices while other people ran. And his first instinct, his only instinct, was to reduce me back into a disposable networking tool for his financial gain. The same man who hid me in a room. The same man who rearranged the seating chart. The same man who called my scars an appetite killer. Now he wanted a meeting with my 3-star commander so he could bid on a government contract. I am an officer. I do not let hostile threats dictate my perimeter. I do not negotiate with people who view me as currency. I typed a single freezing response. Lieutenant Martin is unavailable for civilian contracting. Do not contact this number again. I hit send, the message delivered, read receipt confirmed. Then I pressed my thumb against his contact profile. The screen displayed his unsaved number, the single text thread, and one option at the bottom of the screen in red letters. I pressed it. Block. The command executed a motion as cold, decisive, and final as a firing pin striking a primer. The contact disappeared. The thread vanished. The number was purged from my device, excised from my communications grid with the cold efficiency of a scalpel removing dead tissue. The threat was neutralized. Permanently, I dropped the phone into my chest pocket. I adjusted the collar of my uniform, pressing the fabric flat against the base of my throat where the scar tissue met the regulation neckline. I stepped back out into the blinding Florida sun. The heat pressed against my face, against the raised, jagged, beautiful geography of the scars that told the story of who I was. The same face my father tried to erase from his legacy. The same face a Master Chief recognized through the smoke and fire of a burning ship. The same face my husband kissed like he was mapping the lines of a majestic mountain range. The same face my mother-in-law held in her gentle cafeteria-worn hands like something sacred and irreplaceable. My scars were bathed in the light, undefeated, immortal. If my journey of executing a permanent block on a toxic bloodline to protect my own honor resonated with you, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your own stories of setting boundaries in the comments below. Never let anyone, not even family, make you feel like a ghost in your own life.